title of today's lecture is going to be Democratic and Collective Ownership of Public Goods and Services, Exploring Public-Community Collaborations. We will start with a broader context from Latin America, Europe, and then try to narrow it also to our Balkan context. Luca,
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction. Indeed, my name is Luca, and that is really my name. I hear that that is often, of course, maybe not seen in Serbian here in Serbia. Sorry for not speaking your language, but I'm happy that I can speak in English today, so thank you for that. Yeah, I've just been introduced, and in the recent months I have had the pleasure to work with TNI on a little research or more an advocacy project on democratic and collective ownership of public goods and services. That is part of the Public Alternatives program of TNI, which mainly focuses on helping communities counterforcing privatization of public services and goods in their environment. And so this is part of that research. Also, thank you for the organization and for having arranged everything that well this week. I'm very grateful for having the possibility to have a little contribution to this week, but especially to see so many of you here and to see such an inspiring program this week. So thank you for that. And also, I find it really interesting to be surrounded by so many people again, which is, of course, after periods with Corona and solitude, that was not that common for me anymore. And that is how I would like to open up, and I will mention Corona, although it's not maybe very original anymore. That has partially also been able by a strong public sector. The fact that I have been able to receive my jab has been accorded to research being publicly funded. So although Boris Johnson and pharmaceutical companies said that it was capitalism, including private ownership and including profit making, that led to the quick development of vaccines, it was actually international collaboration and also public funding for research institutes that led to this development. And that leads me again to the fact that it shows a strong case against the large-scale privatization of our public services nowadays. Of course, you are all aware of the fact that there have been huge privatization processes going on. What I want to focus on today is that it mainly individualized us as individuals in society. So the fact that housing became privatized means that we, as an individual, became responsible for finding a house. And that is, I think, one of the parts I would like to focus on. PPPs made then this responsibility of as individuals on the market bigger, and that also led, of course, to other public services. And although a lot can be said about the commons, what we've just also been talking about in the lecture of Daniel, we could see our time as a strategy of the uncommon, so actually of the individual. I am not alone in my critique, actually, on privatization, because when we look worldwide, we can see that there is also a development of deprivatization of public services. I will focus on the municipal level, so that means that I'm only talking about municipalities or regions, so not on national states. So there has been a municipalization trend driven by the wish, among others, for better quality, because private companies could not actually deliver what they promised, driven by the wish to reduce costs, as costs became higher both for public institutions but also for citizens living in cities, and not least driven by the wish to also have more democratic control over these services. So what we can see here on the map is that, well, it takes place almost everywhere, but of course we do see some higher numbers in some parts of the world, that there have been around 1,450 cases of remunicipalization between 2000 and 2021. That doesn't mean that the privatization trend in itself is not ongoing, but at least it is a trend that is also that we can also see today. Okay, and especially the point of public control I would like to mention. I mean, the climate crisis asks for a way how we think about our energy use, the way we travel, the way we cook, but we cannot keep the companies accountable for actually digging for more oil. The housing crisis asks, of course, not for more housing, but for more affordable housing, but we cannot control what is going on the real estate market, which is unfortunately also again backed up, of course, by other institutions like pension funds that are investing both in this global oil, but also in the real estate market. So when we talk then about public control, that means also that we need to start thinking, okay, we cannot control those companies, but we can at the moment also not control the public institutions that are actually favoring those companies. And that, of course, brings me more to the question of today: what and where is the public in public services nowadays? And what does public decision-making mean, but also what can it mean? So for the rest of this talk, I will shortly introduce the idea of public-community collaborations, and then I will provide some real examples that are ongoing. Those are just illustrative of some of the processes that we have commonly seen in the research that I have just been talking about. So there are just some examples of what it could mean in this sense. So my focus will be on alternative forms of ownership and management. So in the broader sense, public-community collaborations mean that there is an active collaboration, what's in the word, between a public body, which is often a municipality, but can also be a public utility service company, and a community. And this community can stand for citizens that have been organizing themselves in which way then ever. That can be in a cooperative, or that can be in a social movement, or in a social movement became political party. So in that sense, I will capture this whole broad idea of social movements or citizens that have collectivized as community for today. Why do I want to talk about those instances? Those active partnerships are actually a way to see how democratic ownership could look like at the local level. So it is one way that we can explore democratization of our public institutions and of our public services for today. That doesn't mean that we do not need other levels, and it also doesn't mean that it is sufficient in itself, but it is one way to see how we can actually open up our democratic institutions. By the way, can you hear me in the back? Otherwise I will try to speak even up more. Can be more? Okay, I will try. Thanks. I will sit straight up for that. Because what is the potential of those public-community collaborations? What we will see is that it's mainly about collaborations which mean that public institutions can really be enriched by citizens, but those public institutions can also enforce citizens' power again. So it's mainly about unlocking local resources, unlocking local power, but also unlocking knowledge that is present in cities, but at the moment actually hardly used by governments. For the rest, it is, I will leave it there. So what you can see on the screen is that I have written down 3 tendencies of public-community collaborations. So first of all, I would like to talk about decentering of public institutions. So what I don't want to mention with public-community collaborations is that the public authority is the most important actor in this sense. It's much more about actually a local government enabling citizens to act and to empower themselves, with public authority being just one among other actors. So that doesn't mean that public institutions should be not funded anymore, or should not have any resources to act, but that should mean that there will become a more horizontal relation between community actors and public institutions, rather than a vertical relation. And that does mean, of course, also acknowledging the power and the informal work done by all those civil institutions that are already doing this work every day. It can maybe best be illustrated by the municipalist movement, of which we've also been talking, of course, or the rebel cities, or many social movements that have been going on also in recent years in cities, which of course started also with Barcelona and Común, for example, close by. But Zagreb has been, of course, another example, but that I will leave that up to you later to talk about that, which is mainly a project of being in, but also be against and beyond the state. So it's being with one leg in, one leg out of institutions, to not actually support local authorities, but actually let local authorities work for citizen-led movements that are outside of those institutions. That leads me actually to the second point of making power emerge. So it's not about integrating citizens in the work of local authorities, but it's actually much more about exploring forms of collective control. In that sense, those public community collaborations should have the goal actually to challenge the state in its everyday behavior and have a kind of counterforce against how local authorities act in everyday life. That also means that there is acknowledgement of the fact that right now cooperatives, but also not-for-profit organizations are 20-0 behind large corporations, of course. Local governments are at the moment large-scale catering for big companies that can easier have lower costs as they just spread their profits, but without actually taking into consideration what kind of ecological or social consequences it has to favor a large corporation. That means also that local governments become aware of the fact that it could also happen in another way. So that is what I mean with making power emerge. That means actively supporting alternative ways of working. And last but not least, I think it's really interesting that we've already talked a bit about the commons. I will use it here also, as I see that those public community collaborations are all about making all spaces in life more politicized. I think it's much more, I do not want to see the commons in this sense as an organizational form. There's an interesting Italian lawyer who has been talking about the fact that commons in an urban context actually always need an enabling state, as the state is always in the possibility actually to allow it or not allow it. So in that sense, that is indeed also taken for granted here, but the commons I would like to see here as politicizing everyday life, but also seeing again all those public institutions and the essential services that they should serve or should provide, that these are part of just our social reproduction processes. So they are needed to live tomorrow again. So in that sense, it's about opening up politics of not only local authority or city council hall, but much more about everyday life, and that you have a say in the rules that actually affect you in your everyday being. Okay, what you can see here is a little overview of the research that we've done. So we've been looking at 80 cases of public community collaborations. So in that sense, it goes beyond the remunicipalization trend, which I've just been talking about, as of course local authorities having ownership over over the resources doesn't mean that it is progressive in itself, right? We have also seen many beautiful, but examples of that in Daniel's keynote talk. Hello. So first of all, I will provide some examples that are really concerned with public and collective ownership. What we've seen going on is that, for example, there are examples of decommodification of land or land acquisition as a way to actually own more urban resources. Second, I would also like to present an example of co-ownership of local infrastructure. So that is part B. So B is really something we see much going on in the energy sector. So, for example, local cooperatives owning part of the grid, or local cooperatives setting up their own renewable energy sources. And there's also the possibility of co-ownership of, for example, a municipal company. That's part C, but I will not go into that today, which is also unique in its sort. Then I will provide an example of co-governance. There are many ways in which participatory democratic processes can be introduced by how public resources are managed. So I would like to provide two from Spain, or one, let's see how time allows us. In a sense, co-governance is more democratic, I would say, as the co-ownership is in this sense, or in a capitalist society, much based on monetary ownership. So there are also mechanisms that do not ask for community benefits for solar panels or investment shares in a municipal company, but that just open up space in that sense. So we will look secondly at co-governance. And third, although this is not a category in itself, I would like to highlight the importance of finance to scale up collaborations. We've also been talking about Eric Olin Wright, and in his part of the 21st, being an anti-capitalist in the 21st century, he also talks about taming capitalism. And maybe many of those examples are a good illustration of taming capitalism, in the sense that it slowly tries to get more money out of the market or out of private properties going to other processes. So in that sense, it can set up a finance stream that goes independently or partially independent, of course, as it is still based on the capital that is going around, but going it to letting it stream to alternative networks and alternative cycles of financing. Okay, once more here, a little overview. I will talk about land decommodification, co-ownership of local infrastructure, then co-governance, and then I will go into one example of public procurement for public services provision. I'll quickly go. Okay, so I will start with public and collective ownership. And to do so, I would like to start with the idea of community land trust. So this is one example of what you could see here of land decommodification. I think many of you are aware of the power of, for example, cooperative housing, which is, of course, means that you are collectively responsible for housing that is in your property. But one interesting example is also the idea of a community land trust. Who of you is aware of the mechanism? Can I see hands? Or most of you are? Or? Well, I will then go into it, otherwise I would skip it, but I will go into it. The idea is, what you can also see with the little hands on the land, is that a community land trust tries to acquire and to own land and keeps that in a trust. So that means that land becomes actually separated from the property that is on the land. As land is, of course, influential for housing prices in general, that is actually a way that a trust or another non-profit organization, it depends, of course, on the juridical status of a country, if a trust is actually seen as an organizational form, can keep prices lower as the land prices do not rise. What is also beautiful about this is that then actually what is built on this land is also decided by a larger community. So that can, of course, be, again, cooperative housing or also public utilities or public space, but also provide, for example, space for small local ownership or enterprises. So the interesting thing of such a land trust is then that it's not only about owning and governing houses collectively, but much more about space stewardship being done together. What is often seen with a community land trust is that a third of people involved are living on the property, a third also of surrounding neighbors. So that means that although you do not live on the plot, you do have a say on how the land is developed. And last, then other stakeholders, which can, for example, be a local municipality, but also other finance sources. So why did I want to show this example? Maybe because it permanently decommodifies land. I think that in Serbia, but correct me if I'm wrong, most of the land is still in the hands of the state, but I've also read about the fact that it can be really privatized right now since 2015. So in that sense, maybe this is a new development that also becomes increasingly important for Serbia, but that's up for discussion afterwards. As I've just mentioned, it's really a form of co-governance of public space development. So, for example, of course, with cooperatives in general, they are the ones with resources that are able to actually start a cooperative or maybe develop cooperative housing, especially if it's not really supported by a local government. So in that sense, it opens up the potential of actually having a say of how urban land can develop. An interesting case in Burlington is that it was started by the local council itself, actually by Bernie Sanders in the 1980s, who actually started it with a fund and also long-term loans by the regional pension fund. So the interesting thing is here that there was collaboration with other public institutions to actually set up the project. And right now, I think 7% is in hands, 7% of the whole housing stock is now in hands of this trust, which is, well, still in 40 years' time, it's something. At least land was privatized before. And it's actually affordable for people who pay or who own only 60% of the median income. So it shows really that also people with owning almost half of the normal income are actually able to be in those buildings. Other beautiful examples of land decommodification take place in Puerto Piray in Argentina, where, for example, land is reappropriated and made a public utility. So really by introducing laws of saying this is public land again. But also in Italy, in Lazio, the possibility for self-rehabilitation cooperatives. What mainly means is that it became a public policy that land or buildings that were not used should be identified and should be up for local tenders. So in that sense, it became possible to directly look at houses that are not used and to transfer them to cooperatives that could then build up further on them. Okay. A second example of public and collective ownership is Plymouth in the UK. And here I would like to go to co-ownership of local infrastructure. Especially in the energy sector, we see that there is a lot of potential to actually set up ownership of the infrastructure. Mainly, of course, because, at least for now, the sun doesn't stop shining. And actually, when you have those solar panels or when you have windmills, that becomes like a generative process that can really expand very quickly. And that's why I would like to show this example of Plymouth in the UK. So what happened here is that the Plymouth Energy Community, which you see in the middle, started as a social enterprise, and they wanted actually to have affordable renewables for everyone in the city. It's a space where a lot of energy poverty also prevailed. So in that sense, the local government also saw that that was really increasingly becoming a problem. So what happened is that the local city council, which you can see on the left, started to really actively support this community with loans, but also by a startup grant and also by staff expertise to actually give this community the possibility to start working on this. So what they do is, when you look at the bottom, is that they started to actually set up infrastructure for solar panels. And it was set up in, I think, 2014, and for now they have around 35 solar panels on rooftops of public buildings. But they are also starting now with actually income from this, from all this infrastructure, which is around 1.5 million for now. That is going back to other local projects, but it's also supporting again the further development. And I think the most interesting thing here is that it's becoming bigger and bigger, and it's also expanding to providing public housing at the moment. So they are starting to open up to actually other sectors. And I think that's why Plymouth is a good example of how energy cooperatives, and also really the critique on energy cooperatives that you can really mention, because at the moment it are mainly, for example, in Amsterdam, you see many cooperatives coming up, but it are mainly higher educated, white middle class people who are involved and paying less than on their energy bills, although people who are not in the possibility to set up an energy cooperative will pay more and more relatively on their gas bills and electricity bills. So in that sense, I think cooperatives, you can definitely criticize them, and I would really like to also afterwards, but I think it can also be mobilized in a way to actually support larger scale urban development. Yeah, so also here there was strong collaboration between the municipality and the community. Governance is nonetheless autonomous, as the Plymouth Energy Community can do whatever it wants by a self-elected board with also a representative of city council, but for the rest they are free to decide how to actually expand. And again, a two-sided financing strategy. So they received loans from the city council, and as you see, of course, often by cooperatives, is that there were community shares, which then meant that people were investing in that. So it's a good case of the just energy transition. And as already mentioned, energy is really a source for community self-sustainability. As it starts, then you will be able to generate more. Okay, I didn't mention it at the beginning, but I'm very happy to break with the one linear idea of a classroom with me talking. So if you have any questions in between, I'm happy to be interrupted. If not, then I will go to the second category of co-governance. And to do so, I would like to go to Cadiz in Spain. So this is a really nice example of where actually a municipalist platform became part of the local coalition. So 2 platform victories in 2015 and 19 led to 2 newly funded parties that became part of the coalition. And what is really interesting is that part of their election campaign, or actually their whole election campaign, was centered around making the energy system of Cadiz, of the town, to make that renewable. So in that sense, it was really centered around the idea of a just energy transition for the whole town. What is the case? There is a municipal energy company, Electrica de Cadiz, but it's only semi-public. So 55% of the shares is in hands of the municipality, but the rest of the shares is in hands of multinational corporations. So it was an opaque organization, and really part of the movement of those coalitions was to make this more, to open this up for participation of citizens and democratize it, but also to really focus on having renewable energy in the city. So what they did is that they set up 2 communities, or 2 committees. So really the co-governance here entails the setup of committees, participatory committees that become involved in the steering of the energy company. So there was one committee that was really focused on the energy transition itself. So for example, setting up commitments, but also reducing energy output, and also seeing how municipal buildings were doing, what they were doing in that case. So it was a committee that met each second week, I think, and was made up by workers from Electrica de Cadiz, but also from city council, also from also citizens. In that sense, everyone can contribute to the committee. And actually, they reached their goal a couple of years ago, as they made possible that the whole municipality is now delivering renewables to the whole city. Or, well, that means 80% of households and all municipal buildings. So within a couple of years, they have actually been enabled to make Cadiz almost run on renewables. And the second thing, which was also a large part of their campaign, was, again, as we saw also before in Plymouth, a just energy transition. As also in Cadiz, energy poverty was quite of a big problem. I think around 15% of people were actually not capable to pay for their electricity bills. The second committee was really involved in seeing how policy of this company, but also how public policy in general, works out for all individuals in the city. So what they did was also try to give advice to citizens, like how to lower their bills, but also how to alter your contract to see if the price can go down, but also see how your houses can be isolated. And by doing so, they also tried to create new jobs, as people were actually receiving courses to become an energy advisor again. So it became, in that sense, again, more than just energy, but more about general development of the city and how you can combine those two. And it's not only, of course, it's quite individualized, right? If you say to an individual, well, you could isolate your house. But what they also did is that they introduced policy that actually made it possible to cut bills for people that are really in financial stress. So in that sense, it is a committee that was really focusing on, okay, where are the people that are still not able to pay this, and how can we actually institutionalize help for lower income households. So that is part of the work that they did. So those two committees were introduced, and I think this is a good example of decentering, what I talked about in the beginning, as actually they expanded power beyond the formal institutions, but really let those committees have a say in further development. And although this case stands also out for me that although it is a semi-public energy company, it was still possible actually to have some influence on what was going on in the city. I think that is interesting. And again, to talk more about a just energy transition, which is of course an important theme this week, is that this transition can be entangled with poverty in general, but also with thinking about job creation can be received. I had one more example of co-governance, but I think I will skip it for time. But it's quite close by. It's Terrassa in Catalonia, and they remunicipalized their water services. And what they did is actually introduce a citizen platform in the form of an observatory. So in a sense, it's the same as the idea of a committee, but the observatory really became involved in the water service policy of the whole city. And well, of course, we know, but Corona crisis made us again aware of the importance, of course, access to drinking water, but also to public tap water points. So they have played a really important role in actually opening up again the space of how water is in this sense governed. So that is another nice case. And here you have a little organogram of how it looks like. Maybe good to shortly tell that there are many of those working groups, and that are really the power behind the observatory, reaching out again to all other civil platforms in the city. So in that sense, this observatory or such a committee, as we saw in Cadiz, can really enable more knowledge sharing in the city and trying to, well, collaborate more in the city, which would not be possible by only a local authority. So in that sense, it really tries to empower other communities with that. Yeah, okay, I will skip this for now. Okay, and last I would like to go to procurement. We've been already talking a bit about, well, creating alternative funds or alternative ways of finance going towards those projects, of course. But large part of the power of such collaborations can also be found by the activities of municipalities themselves, by how they actually procure projects or how they manage their own services. So I would like to talk about insourcing work, but also about procuring workers cooperative in Recoleta in Chile. So what mainly happened there is that a workers cooperative was started because people in a specific company were very much vulnerable to very severe working conditions, and they started their own cooperative. And what happened is that the local authority then actually started to end the contract with this company and decided to procure the cleaning services of the cooperative. So in that sense, by this movement of those the people's movement really led to changing how the government actually supports their work. And that's something that can really be pushed for, and that it's also going on in many cities. And secondly, a nice case, what is especially in Europe the case, is that there are many rules that should favor or that actually in practice favor large-scale companies. For example, I think also in Serbia it has been introduced that procurement should mainly be based on cost efficiency rather than ecological or social outcomes. So that is something that you need to tweak sometimes to see like what can happen if you try to do it in another way. And let's see if I have, oh yeah, sorry, I have it here. Another example of that is in Rennes in France. And what happened there is that they remunicipalized their water, and then they partnered up with farmers to actually buy their products. And what they tried to do is create outlets of the products of the farmers. But they couldn't, of course, because of those rules of the EU, they could not favor local farmers. But what they could do is buy a service of those farmers that they would protect the water catchments in the area. So they bought a service rather than the product of those farmers, and in that sense they tried to tweak a little bit of the rules of the procurement, which is in general in Europe taking place. I think it's a nice example as it shows that although it's really difficult and although there are also many national and European and international rules that can inhibit local activities, there are always ways to tweak them or see how you can maybe go beyond them. So that's a powerful tool to support local and social businesses or cooperatives. It can lead to many public-public partnerships and thereby not favoring private companies, but see how you can do it in another way. And of course, when you start insourcing goods and services, that creates an infrastructure for the support of more cooperative work. So in the case of Rennes in France, what I've just been talking about with buying farmers' products from close by, is that they started to set up school meals, so that created more outlets for the projects of the farmers. So then groups that were working for those school meals were created on schools. In that sense, also another expansion project was going on. In that sense, it's what's also called in Preston, the Preston model. Preston is a city in the UK and has worked a lot on how to tweak procurement in favor of local cooperatives. And they found out also that anchor institutions, so public institutions like schools and hospitals and prisons, are crucial to actually create this platform for further collaboration with cooperatives. Okay, so we've been looking shortly at public and collective ownership in several ways. Secondly, we have been looking at some ways of co-governance. And third, we've been looking at at the importance of public procurement. This looks like shameless self-promotion, but it isn't. I have here a little report on what of many of what I've been talking about. You can read again. But especially I want to highlight the second appendix, as there are many cases, or much more cases mentioned that you can look at to see how those different categories, so ownership, governance, and finance, can look like in practice. So that you can find here if you are interested. Maybe to conclude, many of these cases embody mechanisms of power sharing and co-governance and public-public relations. And what I found interesting is that they are able to actually find common ground. So what many of those did is actually focus on a specific common, like water or energy, but are able then actually to center other social important issues in a city around such commons. So in that sense, focusing on, for example, water remunicipalization can lead to much more than only this water remunicipalization. So in that sense, it can ignite further collaboration in cities. Many of those are also strong because they expand to multiple sectors. So, for example, owning land doesn't only mean owning land, but also means that you can maybe have more say about urban development in general. But also an energy cooperative can start working on community housing, as we saw in Plymouth. So in that sense, it's a strong case to see how actually urban struggles are mainly based, of course, on the same problems, and how you can see how collaboration between different sectors can look like in practice. And many of those examples actually show that you need a lot of knowledge about economic decision making in the city, about tender processes, and also about current PPP constructions. Especially, of course, when maybe a contract comes to an end, that is the moment to act and to see if that can be changed. So that is something for the long term to think about. We're of course not quite there yet. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on those examples, but also about your experiences in your own regions, especially how reinventing public services in neoliberalism look like, because public community collaborations can really well be mobilized within neoliberalism. It's really easy to offset responsibility in general to an underfunded community. It's really easy to romanticize a community without taking into balance that, of course, there are, again, power struggles playing out also between 3 or 4 people. And it's also really easy to talk about this, although we are in a time that urban spaces are much underfunded. So that are definitely things we have to take into account when we're talking about this topic. Also, of course, we can have many energy cooperatives, but then we can still have a national government that is investing in oil. So what do we do with that, and how can you balance those, or what are the contradictions in that? And of course, what is the difference between cities when you look at those examples? I mean, some cities are richer than others and have more possibility to procure. So we should think about that. And also, of course, we are in many spaces in hostile political environments. And I'm very well aware that many of those examples were made possible by a municipality that was supportive. So what do you do when that's actually not the case? Although some were supportive only after 13 years or 15 years, so it needs a long breath. So what is your view on that? And then maybe to really conclude, I would like to show a quote by Silvia Federici, who has worked on the commons a lot from a more feminist viewpoint. And she said, "This world is a world that cannot reproduce us. Unless we come together and reconstruct the social fabric of our towns, creating new solidarity bonds, we will not be able to wage the type of struggle that we need to regain control over our lives and reclaim the wealth that we have produced. We have to see the commons not only as an objective to be reached in the future, but as the base for our struggle." So I think that actually sums it nice up. And thereby I would also like to open up the floor and see which common struggles we have here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luca. We can now go into the questions. And then also in a very shared discussion that everybody participated. And I will also introduce Jovica and Darko. But let's go with the first question. Sorry.
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
You have given us a couple of examples in the area of water service and production. But I'm interested in waste management, and that is a big problem for many different local communities here in Serbia. We have that big and visible problem. Okay. So is there any good example of this practice of public community collaborations and ownership in the area of waste management?
That's a good question. Well, of course,
it is something that can be ruled by community and local.
Yeah. I know one example, I think, in South Africa that has worked on actually collective waste management. And for example, cleaning cooperatives are of course partially also involved with waste, but it's maybe not completely the same. I know that there has been some remunicipalization of waste going on in the Netherlands, for example. But I don't know for the rest, South Africa then as an example. There it was really like bottom up, starting with, okay, it is a mess here, we have to do, which became later also supported by local authorities. Yeah. Maybe if Daniel, if you want to, if you know an example, then I'm happy to hear from you also.
There's a good example from Brazil.
Brazil, okay.
And that has to do with supporting the communities of recyclers. That in many cases are the poorest of the poor. And they have to recycle garbage, basically, in really bad working conditions. So when the Workers' Party was in government in different cities of Brazil, what they tried to do is to organize some kind of community municipal partnership in which the municipality would provide infrastructure, for instance, trucks and recycling machinery, to improve the working condition of the community. But it was more an experimental project than a large-scale solution.
Do you know maybe where in Brazil? Do you know maybe where in Brazil?
Yeah, as far as I know, in Porto Alegre was tried.
Okay.
But when the right-wing government came back to government, the whole process was over. Then in Sao Paulo, they also tried it in a larger scale, but I don't think it continues. It was a good attempt, but when the government changes, it goes back to zero.
And in Europe, we don't have any similar example. I mean, in Europe, especially in western part of Europe, the problem of weekends is more or less solved. But I don't know any.
I don't know of anyone, of any. Maybe.
Maybe I can add to that. I don't know if you heard the Block 70 zajednička akcija, Transaction. They have a relatively good waste management. They collect with a community paper, plastic, and then the public institution called Zelenilo Belgrade comes with a truck and buy all the collected garbage, and from that money they buy trees and plant trees.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
But it's very hard work by enthusiasts.
It stays within the citizens' initiatives.
Exactly.
Communication with somebody who is providing
That's interesting. I think it's interesting that you bring it up, especially as it is quite often still a municipal service. But for example, in Amsterdam, there are some stall holders on the market that actually try also to get the waste management in their own control. But it's up to now it's impossible to change it because the municipality has so many strict rules of how it should look like. So that is a case where they are still like trying to find space to have their own system. But it's already going on for like 4 years now, I think. Yeah. So that's. Yeah.
Could I ask one question? And also then like to introduce other discussions. But most of the examples were about municipal town level, of course. I mean, because of all our values, etc. But also. All the examples most of the examples were about the areas that are mostly solely the towns are responsible for. In a way. Do you know any examples of this kind of public-civic cooperation? Where it's about the area or some policy in which also is state involved? Where you have division of powers between the state and towns in providing those services, etc. For instance, in Serbia, the health policies are divided between the state and the responsibles and also municipalities are responsible for one part of the services in the healthcare that are provided. So I suppose there are also similar situations in Europe and other countries. And do you know what's happening when there is other actor involved, which is state? And do you know any examples where state accepted this kind of public-civic ownership, cooperation, etc.?
Yeah, interesting. Well, I know, for example, that we have many self-employed people in the Netherlands. And it's impossible for them to actually have sufficient social benefits or to pay for their insurances because it's just too high for the money that they're normally having within a monthly period. So they started what you could call bread funds. So actually then groups of self-employed people started to come together to have their own kind of security system. But that's taking place completely autonomous from the national government. Of course, it's allowed. I mean, you can gather money on one bank account. That's fine. So that are systems that are more autonomous than where a public government is involved. So yeah, I think you need. Of course, when we talk about remunicipalization, it is indeed often because it was, of course, of the state or a responsibility of the state, and for a reason, I think. So yeah, that brings maybe up an interesting question of how much of this responsibility should indeed also be there with the state or not. Yeah, that's maybe a question for the audience. Like, could you think of things that should not be, where the state should not be involved anymore? That is, of course, an interesting question.
Yeah. Because what I aim with this question is that, like, you also presented us, the way some of these initiatives started, and often there was municipal politics and municipal actor that recognize the need and also the good characteristics of this type of collaboration, and then from also from above, recognize some initiatives, and then provided institutional design so it can happen already. So if we speak, there are like several areas of regulation. One is the level of the actors within the town, citizens, but also the workers within that public service, for instance.
Yeah.
So could you maybe, like if you could add a little bit what type of preconditions you see that needs to be fulfilled in order to have a fruitful, public civic cooperation and ownership?
Yeah, I think what we could call the street level bureaucrats is probably a term some of you have heard of. The idea that maybe it doesn't really mention what the power is of the coalition, the local coalition, but that you need civil servants that are using their power within the municipality. So I think that is often the case, that you need some people that are actually striving for those community-led initiatives. Further again, it can also really help to have like a public institution behind you, which was of course then the case in Burlington, that was financed with community land trust, which means that you're really backed up by a strong institution. But for example, also in London, there is currently a market that is in hands of the Transport for London, so the public infrastructure, that can maybe be taken over by the stallholders themselves, as long as they fulfill the needs, of course, of public transport in that area. So in that sense, it can really help to have these public institutions standing behind you, which has been often the case. But I think, it is not easy. When we look at those examples that really citizens became involved in ownership or governance, it's around 4% of all the municipalization projects or remunicipalization projects that have been going on. So in that sense, it's really a small part of what is going on in general on the local level when we look at remunicipalization. What was my point? I wanted to say something. And that often it is, of course, involved with local struggles. So, for example, in Recoleta in Chile, it took them 14 years to actually change this public procurement rule. So, in that sense, it is really a long struggle for many of those movements. But also the observatory in Terrassa, which I really shortly mentioned, still has struggles with the local municipality. So, although this observatory is there as really pushing for further democratization, it's not, of course, all happy together until the end. That is ongoing struggles, I think. Yeah.
If anybody else would like to share this also.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to ask for a comment. I guess what is my, let's say, problem with this, all the solutions you presented,
yeah,
with public community collaboration,
yeah,
rely on making profit in the end.
Yeah.
So I guess you said in the beginning it's a way of paying capitalism,
Yeah.
it's a way of giving maybe a human face or whatever. But coming from the health sector,
Yeah, good
I
point.
see there are an obvious problem if you're not doing, there are things in our lives which just cannot make profit.
Yeah.
And is there space there to make those collaborations? And how do we overcome this problem? Because let's suppose that somehow that's a way out of those collaborations. They stop making profit.
Yeah.
But then, do they just fall apart? Or,
Yeah.
I mean, how do we fight against that? And maybe if you can name some examples in the area of healthcare, that would be, because otherwise we rely on charity, on capitalism, that I see as a big problem.
Yeah, really great contribution. Thank you. I think healthcare sector is a really interesting sector in this case. Especially indeed because I think we need larger scales for that. Like in general, that is what's going on. Well, there are good examples of, for example, kindergartens that became cooperatives, or of course, community kitchens, which I would also put under care in that sense. But that, of course, means indeed that you're still relying on people actually contributing with labor, of course, which is often unpaid, or at least it's you're getting, of course, then childcare back. But in that sense, it's another system. Well, of course, in Recoleta in Chile, there has also been the introduction of public pharmacies, together with the recontribution of how much you have to pay for pharmaceutical products. So in that sense, it was really reclaiming by the state itself, by the municipality itself, which was done by a communist mayor. That then led to full publicization of the service again. So I think health sector is a really interesting case where, in the end, I think much public funding needs to go to. Yeah, definitely.
I was going to refer not to the health sector, but to the first part of your comment about how many of these experiences operate within the market.
Yeah.
And how they are related to profit making. I think that's a very relevant comment because it's held to what Luca was saying at the beginning of not romanticizing this kind of experience. And I was going to refer to examples of energy. About 3 months ago, before 6 months ago, TUED, Trade Union for Energy Democracy, published a beautiful report about the rise and fall of community energy in Europe. Because we all love energy problems. And we have to be aware that they are very much dependent in market mechanism and a whole European legislation that enable the rise of these cooperatives at some moment. Now those mechanisms, including the institutional support, is going away, and many of these cooperatives are going through really hard problems because they operate within market mechanisms.
Yeah, and what you often see is that those energy cooperatives are, of course, presenting themselves as a community, but they're always driven by one or two persons who are contributing so much informal work to actually keep them going. Definitely, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Luca. I will now ask Darko, recently was among others, please to raise hands, people can vote this year.
Yes.
Okay. So, Jovica is our friend from Croatia, from BRID, it's a basis for workers' initiative and democratization. I hope that I translated it properly. And Darko is from Belgrade, and he is from Center for Politics of Emancipation. And they are, for the last 10 years or even more, involved in different type of analysis of policies and politics in Balkans and also in different type of struggles that always were in a way aiming of thinking policies that would be really public, getting very public into the public policies and into the public services. So basically, I would, demystify everything. We have a script for these further questions. So basically, I would like them to present their work, to work with their organizations, but also there is neither smaller role, neither greater fact. So,
We'll just good news. We'll change this classroom today afternoon.
yeah.
Well, and it was also garbage pickup, so in that sense, it's always it's good.
So, I would ask Dr. Robinson to reflect by presenting the work of their organizations, to also, state, because we spoke about preconditions for establishing public civic ownership and provision of services. So, by your opinion, how do we build those preconditions on the levels of workers, professionals within the public services, whether it's national or local public services, on the level of preconditions among citizens that are also the users of those services, and also on the level of public institutions, how we push them to recognize the institutional framework that would allow this type of collaboration for better services. And by your opinion, do even the professionals within services see the citizens and the cooperation with them as a way of improving their own position within the public services? Because deterioration of the public services is always connected, almost always connected with deterioration of the rights of the workers within those services. So, how do they see, improvement of public services and collaboration with the citizens as a way of improving their own position?
Would you like to come to the front also? Maybe that's good. I can decenter myself.
Yeah. Bring your chair.
Yeah.
We can go even further into the corridor.
Let's go ahead. I'll have to reflect on these questions.
Okay, hi, my name is Darko. I also from CD, Center for the Politics of
Louder.
I'm from Center for the Politics of Emancipation, organization that works, well, this year it is 10-year anniversary. Sorry for my English. People don't usually understand me when I speak without the mask, so if you don't understand it, please ask me to slow down to repeat something. I also have spoke in front of the live audience sometimes, so it is, coming back to life. So our organization is mostly focused on political education and research work in the last 10 years, but also trying to build cooperation with different actors in different fields. One of the fields of interest is public goods for us. Today we're mostly focused on educational programs, besides the socialism that we are organizing for 5 years now, and striving for the improvement of working conditions and wage levels in the garment and shoe industry. CD is part of the Clean Clothes campaign, global campaign that is focused on the workers' issue in this field, in these industries globally. And what we like to say that our mission is promotion of the concepts and ideas of equality and economic democracy, and so basically what we do is promotion of socialism. So we can sum it like this. And when we talk about this, and like Luca said and Alexander pointed out, when we talk about curbing the capitalism, taming the capitalism, maybe my main issue would be also with this. When we talk about commons and expanding the commons, we're talking about providing the services people need to reproduce themselves. If we provide enough services for people to reproduce them, then we have the question: why would we still need dominance of the capitalist mode of production?
You asked me to support.
Okay.
Yeah, you can also put it back.
Are you mounted?
Yes, speakers can do that.
Speakers can outlook the masks.
So the question then would be, why would we still talk about dominance of the capitalist model of production? Not necessarily removing all the markets, but if we provide enough services and commons, then we can talk, let's call it democratic socialism or however we want to call it, but producing the goods and services in a way to satisfy the most of the needs for reproduction of one societies. Then, when we try to upscale this, then we have another problem: is balancing of different interests, especially coming from society that today is dominantly based on market production. Different interest groups, not only across class, but even inside of given classes, have different interests in different specters and different locations. So that is something that we need to think about. It is much easier to talk about communalization of goods services on small communities, especially wealthy communities. But we need to think in a globalized world, commercially globalized markets, how this production can be sustainable. One's struggle for it is, like we also said, can be a very long-term process, but once we build that, it is not something that will necessarily stay that way. It's not something that won't be subject to reprioritization and stuff like this. We have to keep in mind that our main problem is not neoliberalism as such. Our main problem is capitalism. Neoliberalism was not just an irrational decision or irrational, let's say, a solution for the problem. It was very rational for the crisis that capitalism was in that point. I went a bit too far for Robert asked, but prerequisite for building things sustainably would be what we will talk these days about building of institutions of solidarity. But it is one thing to say that, but that solidarity has to be sustainable. It is one thing to call for solidarity between the groups that have the same interest. That is easy. You can also call for solidarity between groups that have non-competing interests, but when you have competing interests, when groups have opposite interests of resources and how they are used, then we have the main problem, and that is what we have to think if we want to upscale all this. I think these examples are very, very important, and we have to learn about it. But when we try to upscale it, my guess, I don't know, Luca can probably say better. My guess is that most of these communities are richer or have more enough resources that they can manage. When we upscale things, we usually find ourselves in a situation like with a shorter blanket when we try to cover all parts, but some part has to stay revealed. Involving different actors like workers and professionals, it is also important that we have to keep in mind what are their short-term and long-term interests also. So for the workers, especially in poor areas, in poor societies, poor countries, their immediate interest is usually just better wage, better working conditions, and stuff like this. They don't necessarily think about their role in management process they're not necessarily interested in. We did a research during the last year in the automotive industry and how the possibilities of transformation of the automotive industry. Whenever we talk with workers' representatives, be that from syndicate or from other areas, they never they are never thinking about their role in management. They are not interested in that. The only thing that they are interested in their job protection, working conditions, and possibly raising the wages. So they are much more interested in businesses coming in, privatized businesses, than trying to build some management structure that will involve them. So this is very important. The long-term interest can be, they maybe can understand the long-term interest, but short-term is always dependent on how well protected they are. Also, the workers who are, let's say, who are in industries that are better paid, for example, the electric distribution in Serbia, their interest can be very different from what we would call public interest. So they necessarily don't see themselves as they would not want more decision-making being put on the communities. They want to protect their position because they are in a good position. Their wages are great, their working conditions usually are great, so they don't have what to complain about. And similar thing is with parts of the communities. So, for example, again, with electricity in Serbia, it is relatively cheap still in comparison with region in Europe. So a lot of actors don't really have an interest in changing that, introducing practices that could raise the price of it. So market can be very cruel here because it can very easily punish these kind of initiatives if they don't have a perfect condition. I maybe went too far with all this. My idea would be this. If we want to build something, what we need is those institutions of solidarity. In Marxist terms, it is called praxis, let's call it. Starting building communities through struggle. This is not a one-way street that this can go backwards, but this is what we need to think about, and I guess we'll talk what this encompasses more during these days. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Darko. Jorice, would you like to continue? You can speak on this more theoretical level or go on speak from experience of collaboration with the real people.
No, I mean, thanks to Luca and Darko, I think this was great introduction, so I think that maybe it would be better to speak from the experience that we had and still actually have in Zagreb. First, a couple of words on the organization. So, as the name says, we are primarily interested in workers' rights and democratization at the workplace, but not only in the workplace, but also in the community and in the, that would be, let's say, that our organization is doing. And that said, I would say that, I mean, if we are talking about the preconditions of any public communal partnership in managing of public companies, utensils, and so on, I would say that we ought to have in mind three things. First would be political landscape. Second would be, I think, legal framework, and the third, maybe the most important, because without the third one, it will not function at all. And those are social initiatives, movements, so social actors. And I mean, if you have those three things, those three preconditions in mind, I would say that we as an organization have been trying the most to do something with this third part, and those are social actors, and those social actors are presented as initiatives, but also trade unions as representatives of the workers of the working class. And we have been collaborating with different trade unions, so in different branches, different sectors, from waste management to healthcare, to transport and so on. But maybe since these two examples have been brought out, so the waste management and the healthcare, maybe I will just go with examples from those two sectors. So presently in Zagreb, I don't know, I mean, it's like in the newspapers. Presently in Zagreb, the subject of waste management is, let's say, a really hot topic that our new mayor has to deal with. But basically, it all started, of course, during the past administration. So the past mayor, he was in power for 20 years, in 2000 until the last year when he died. And concerning waste management, so his idea of waste management was to outsource as much as he could. So we have, I believe, the same or similar is also here in Serbia. So we have publicly owned waste management company called Čistoća, and that publicly owned company used to deal with different kinds of waste in the city of Zagreb. And then over the years, the mayor started to outsource. So I don't know, first he outsourced this, I don't know, big waste, long as I don't know what's the English term. Then afterwards, he outsourced also the bio-waste, and then outsourced the places where that waste is going to be like put. And so it went through the years. And most of those most of that outsourcing actually went only to one company, to one private investor, who was before known as somebody, who was like a pretty shady investor who used to be in different kind of, let's say, illegal activities, also connected to the war, post-war times, etc. And so his company grew bigger and bigger, and somewhere beginning 2010s, his company was big enough to take this whole operation to the another level. And then in 2013, the mayor decided that he is going to put waste management of city of Zagreb on a public tender. And so the best offer is going to be accepted. And what did that mean to the public waste management company? Well, the plan was that they are going to put all their assets to the city. So all the trucks, all the facilities, everything would go to the city, and then that company could also give their bid to that public offer. And that was the moment that different civil actors, let's say in Zagreb, recognized where this is leading, and then we decided to make protests against it. And I think those protests were really important because they managed so actors from different branches of civil society came together, and these protests were organized together by the trade unions, who were actually representing workers who worked in that public company, us as a civil organization that was into workers' rights, environmental organizations, and also right to the city organizations. And it was like the first time that the mayor saw those actors together, and he was like really perplexed. He didn't know what was going on, because before that action, usually trade unions did not organize something like that with the civil society organizations, because that divide is like really wide. Trade unions are big organizations at that time and still pretty traditional, and civil society organizations usually financed on projects and not really into workers' rights at that time. And it was really, like I would say, some kind of a game changer, because the administration then decided not to go with that plan and just to continue with this slow privatization or outsourcing of different services. And now we go 7 years after. Now the people who were actually organizing those protests are in power, including the mayor. And now he has to deal with all those problems of waste management that came piling up in those 20 years. And against him, he has this big investor, which is now really, I mean, he's really powerful. He has the biggest waste management company in Zagreb, maybe also in Croatia. And now we are seeing the different problems that are coming up. Also, the media is like, okay, we're not sure, maybe, well, we should just have the cheapest service. It's not really important. Is it done by the publicly owned company, or is it done by the private company? And private company already has all this advanced technology, and the public company doesn't have anything. And it doesn't have, I mean, it's not like they don't have anything, but I mean, they are lacking a lot of machinery that is needed to process the waste, because, I mean, it hasn't been really invested in the company in the last 10 to 15 years. And now, I mean, there is a problem. Why am I talking about, or why did I mention in the beginning political landscape? Because now we have a situation where there is a there is a city administration which wants to insource all these services, which wants the public waste management company to stay in public ownership, and even to democratize it more by involving the citizens, so the end users. And it wants to modernize, so to invest in that company, but has problem that you have all this legislation concerning with public procurement and the EU legal frame shift, which in a way puts a lot of obstacles on the process, because to get all these machines, okay, it needs money, but that money you can get from the EU funds, but then it takes time. And procurement rules. Yeah, and procurement rules. You have to follow all the procurement rules, because if you don't, then you have to do it all over again. And as you can imagine, if you have waste piling up in the streets, then people are not really happy about it. So actually, I mean, you have the will to do it. You know more or less ways to do it. But presently, I mean, we will see where will it take us. But presently, the biggest problem is the time. So that would be like something that has been going on in Zagreb for, let's say, the last 10 to 15 years, and now in the last, I mean, since the city government changed in June, it's really speeding up, and I suppose in the next months we'll see what will happen. And the other example was healthcare system. In our organization we have one group which has been dealing with healthcare for some time, for the last, let's say, 6-7 years. What they have been doing was trying to research how the healthcare system was organized in Croatia and Yugoslavia, beginning from the early 20th century, and they have also made connections with the School of Public Health, and they are experts, and they also made connections with the international organization, which is based on non-profit healthcare, which is called People's Health Movement, and it is like a worldwide organization which originates from what used to be called Third World, so countries like, I don't know, countries in Africa, India, South America, and so member of our organization is actually for the past year coordinator of the People's Health Movement for Europe. and it is like pretty. I mean, I don't know much about it, but I mean, if you or somebody else is interested, I mean, I can connect you with Hannah, who's actually doing coordination of that group and the stuff they're doing. And I mean, it's really, but I mean, what I can say, it's really interesting to see that, I mean, there is a worldwide movement of non-for-profit healthcare, and it is also really interesting to see what happens, I mean, when you establish connections with different actors inside, for instance, Croatia, and by different actors, I mean, trade unions that organize workers in healthcare system, also professionals like people from this public health school, Andrés Tankvar. And I mean, what happens when you actually, after some time of serious work, start to create actually some kind of counter narrative, which I think is really important, and maybe one of the most important things when we are talking about, I mean, what the topic of this session, because without those counter narratives, it is pretty difficult to try to, let's say, slice into the mainstream media and to come to citizens, to people. That is something similar to what Garp also mentioned with the Clean Calls campaign. We also members of that initiative, but not that active as CP. But yeah, okay, I will stop here, and if you have any comments.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you, Jorica. And yeah, you can ask anybody here present or just share your thoughts.
I have a question for Darko. When you mentioned dealing with the automobile industry, I was wondering what's it like dealing with the public? So what's like the biggest struggle with dealing with the public, and do you think they're pessimistic, and how engaged are they? And do you think they're willing to participate, or do you think they're kind of lacking motivation in this political climate in our country?
You think like workers or citizens?
Citizens, yeah.
Citizens. Well, we didn't research citizens because this wasn't. But what we did research are different initiatives that are dealing with topics of mobility, of alternative mobility, like cycling or stuff like this. So they are interested. They are by definition already versed politically and everything. Why the public is not considering that much? Or why the public is not thinking about automotive industry as such in that way, especially because automotive industry in Serbia is barely existing. We are not producing basically any type of cars anymore, even Fiat stops production. So yeah, what we saw was mainly with lower level management and workers in those companies is that they are not thinking about their role in this. From that, we can make deduce that the general public is of a similar opinion. But yeah, I think that is something that has to be taught. That is something that has to be built. This idea of people involved in governing of production and the way how to be involved in that. And that part of learning has also to have the process of learning to balance this interest that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, for now, this narrative of alternative way of production. I mean, automotive industry is far away from being publicly owned, but even involvement of different groups in it is. When we speak about production of waste management, people do have probably some parts of public do have idea that they should be involved in this, but then there is talk about knowledge required for this, time required for this, and are these groups who would be involved, are those already privileged part of society that would have enough time, resource, time, and everything, or what are the ways to involve the less privileged in all this and to balance all their different interests. From this research about automotive industry, what we can see is the research was partly focused on the green transition. So what we asked the subjects was what is their view there. Workers don't care about it. They can care about ecology in a general sense, but when talking about auto industry, they are hoping that factories that are moving from EU would come here to produce petrol engines. They don't care about what they want are jobs, basically. Only the other groups are worrying about pollution and ecological sustainability and stuff like this.
Please do.
Yeah, my question is to both of you. I was wondering, just because this was mentioned also in your lecture, this let's say discrepancy between the two, maybe it's not related to this topic that much, but nevertheless, between the two branches, so to say, of workers, so the precariat and the industrial workers, the classical workers. So I was wondering, do you have maybe, like, out of your mind, some data about the number of industrial workers, anyways, in Serbia and Croatia? In Croatia, this is a very small number of people. We know that Croatia is a very tourist-dependent country. In Serbia, I would also say it's a small number of people. So I'm wondering how this prospect influences the ways we think, this democratization of the workplace, which workplace? I would guess that this is such a small number of workers are, actually, working in the industry.
Well, I did know, I forgot the number actually of number of industrial. Although there is a problem maybe with the definition what is considered industrial works. If we consider the manual workers outside of the service sector, actually in Serbia that number has risen in the last couple of years. It is not insignificant number. It is still the main motor of.
Can you guess, is it like 20%?
No, I think it is higher because I think it is. I'm not sure.
20%, 5 to 10%. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it is not just 5%. Those workers, those are then generating the revenues for other sectors. So the service sector lives from this part, especially in southern and the northern part of the country. There is still production. Yeah,
but I'm also thinking, sorry for interrupting, that there's also a huge number of peasants, of agricultural workers, which is unusual. For example, in Serbia. So this is I would say there are more agricultural workers than industrial workers at this point.
I don't know for that.
I'm also not sure, but I think these are three types of totally different.
As far as I know, I don't have exact data.
Okay, services 57%, industry 27%, agriculture 15%.
Thank you.
27% industry, agriculture 15%. 2020.
Okay. I think that Jovica would like to.
It's kind of maybe it's better to think in terms of what does democratization mean, for instance, in the service sector, in the touristic sector, or in retail in Croatia. It would mean, first, that you have a collective agreement. We don't have it in those sectors. if you don't have a collective agreement, then that means that the rights that those workers are having, as we know from the experience, how many hours, especially during the season, during the summer, people are working in restaurants, in bars, in clubs, I don't know, with yachts, etc. It means that their working conditions are really, really bad. And if that is the case, I mean, that would be like ground zero. I mean, having a collective agreement would be a ground zero for those workers, even to start to organize and think about anything else. Because, like Darko said before, I mean, because Robert's question was, are workers actually are thinking even about the governance of the companies, etc. I mean, their first interest is wage. And is that wage going to be a little bit higher or lower? Because, I mean, presently, even that is like, as we know, I mean, the wages are really low, collective agreements more or less non-existent.
Yeah.
And so, I think that it's kind of deceiving, you know, to ask, are there industrial workers and what's their percentage? I mean, I think we should say, okay, service sector is dominant now in, let's say, in Croatia it is. Okay.
They are also workers.
Should democratization of the governance in that sector, should that be an interest of workers who are working the sector? Yes. And who has to do something about it? Well, I think that the first actor who should do something about it should be the unions. Because the unions should have, I mean, theoretically, they should have some kind of power to do something about it. Theoretically. In practice, I mean, there is a lot of problems, we can talk about it later. But, I mean, if we are talking about the unions, we are coming back, I think, at least we are coming back to those social actors that should be here if we want to take about, because democratization, I think, democratization is not going to happen without the push from below. And who is going to do that push? I mean, it's really difficult to have, organized initiatives do not just pop out of the bloom. I mean, it's like there has to be a lot of preconditions. I mean, okay, yeah, I'm talking too much. Sorry.
I mean, I'm sorry for just one.
Could you just please take off your mask?
Make a final point.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, for me, it's not really, I mean, my question wasn't that much about the sector, but about the type of work. For example, in tourism, you know, in Croatia, or, you know, in Serbia, like, more than in Serbia, more than 1/3 or 2/5 of the workers are non-standard workers. In tourism in Croatia, these are, you know, seasonal workers. How you can speak about democratizing the workplace when they have no workers in the real sense, you know. They change it each season. There's no any kind of this, you know. I'm just thinking about this, how to approach this from also, I mean, we know, like, for example, in Croatia, seasonal workers are mostly foreign, for example, you know, so this is something that's going to happen in Serbia as well, probably in different sectors. So can we use this, can we rely on this old, you know, like old, not only language, but practices?
It's not old. Why do you think it's old language and practices?
Because, you know, like, what union, who does this union represent?
We have, okay, I mean, not to bore people, but I mean, you have the union that is organizing people who are working in tourist sector. You also have union that organizes workers who work in retail sector, so in shops, etc. And I mean, those unions are not, at least in Croatia, they're not really powerful, and I mean, there is a reason why they're not powerful. And those reasons, I mean, it's kind of, you know, you have to dig more into the economic system and the trajectory of what was happening when the foreign big malls and, you know, when they were coming to Croatia, and also what was happening with the big touristic companies who existed before, so bigger hotels, also chains of restaurants, etc. And why they were not being able to live on? Why were they demolished? And I mean, most of them have been demolished to free the market share for the people who were coming. Not only foreigners, also domestic capital. But I mean, it's not like, I don't know, Sunčani Hvar, chain of hotels on Hvar, like it bankrupt. How is that possible? You know, I mean, there were reasons why it went bankrupt, and so I think it's much better to try to think, you know, in like specific, to go from specific cases to see what are the patterns. I think it's much better than, you know, just to go and say, okay, I mean, this is like, we cannot use it anymore. Because I mean, I know from practice that we can. Sorry, I mean that question.
Sorry, just to add to this. I agree that there is the precarization, and this precarization is not just in seasonal workers, it's not just workers who work on the internet, and also many workers in industry, industrial sector are also very precarized. What would be the adjective? In Serbia, for example, there is a very small percent of unionization in private sector. I'm not sure, it has risen a bit in the last couple of years, but it is still insignificant. It is so insignificant that you can't really influence. And then you also have the problem of the negotiation, because you have the socio-economic council, that you should be the body that you negotiate between the workers' representatives and capital representatives, domestic capital. But foreign capital representatives do not sit on this council, and they have a power to push the legislative outside of this. So they can surpass the whole mechanism, and you basically can't do at this point nothing about this. But the unionization, the trying to build unions is basically the only way. For some sectors, it seems almost impossible, but unionization in that sectors can be better when the unionization is those sectors that more traditional is stronger. If you can manage to empower those unions, if they can gain more power and more negotiation, bargaining power, then that can maybe theoretically trickle the effect of the unions. But these unions have to be aware of that. These unions have to learn that they cannot just protect the interests of the core workers. When we talked about the idea of water companies, for example, there is also workers' representatives, unions representatives in these companies that they want to protect the interests of the core workforce in a water supply company, and they are happy to let the non-essential, let's call it, or more or less essential workers go to outsourcing to the agencies and everything. So they will protect their basic wages, they can get raises, because others are getting cut and stuff like this. So this is the struggle. You basically wait for, you try to build the organization and wait for the perfect moment when that organization can have enough power to influence stuff. So when you have, I don't know, crisis, when you have the exodus of the workforce that go to work on the West, then the workers who stay here maybe can have, I mean, this is just one of example scenarios, but you try to wait for the better moment to strike, for example. What is that? I cannot say at this point.
Okay, so thank you then. Sashka, would you like maybe to add or reflect before we go to the further question? Okay. Could you please?
I have a first question for Luca. If you can dig deeper into this resourcing aspect of public-community collaboration. I mean, you mentioned these innovative finances. So, in relation to that, who controls them? Who who controls these flows, especially if we are thinking about decentralization and not really defined less resource communities. So it has two dimensions. First, what exactly they are. You mentioned returning profit. Is it only, or we are talking also about local currencies that are being developed? Or so this is what are they? And second is mechanisms behind them.
Yeah.
So are we talking about solidarity economy, supply and exchange chains, or how that actually functions? And it is in terms of current situation, what we have so far around the world. And second part is related to DARPA's, and it's for you. So thinking about future, as Luca finished with Federici's quote that this is basically about social reproduction that we actually need to take out of the market. What, in terms of resourcing this public-community collaboration, we need to take in mind in terms of, I don't know, monetary, fiscal, or any other aspect in order to deal with internal contradictions and not like make more mess or I don't know.
Thank you for your question. I think what those initiatives embody is mainly trying to create self-sustaining circles of finance, right? So that mainly means that money that is within a cooperative will stay there for in principle, or what many of those examples do is that there is a specific fund where money goes to and which is democratically decided upon what to do with it. But it's fairly easy to write, of course, in your juridical status like that money can only be used for specific purposes. So in that sense, it can be democratically decided upon, but also in advance already decided what kind of goal it should serve in the first place. It's indeed mainly about getting money to those initiatives or getting it out of the market, which can happen through procurement, but also through loans backed up by public institutions, of course. I think finance is one of the most trickiest things, definitely. I mean, that's also the reason why they're not popping up everywhere, that they are not always having a very long life after all. So I think those two mainly come in, and it's of course also using all those public institutions in a city that need services anyway and that can also sustain each other again. There are definitely also examples of communities or mainly neighborhood communities that have developed their own currencies. So for example that you can, of course you need a really long period and also really collaboration in a neighborhood, but of course there are examples that you can buy bread with a currency that you get through other informal work, for example. So those examples do exist. And your second question, or your second part was?
I mean, you partially responded, like mechanism. First was what are they?
Yeah.
And second, who controls them? And
okay, in that sense, yeah.
Okay, if I understand the question, okay, when we take into account monetary and fiscal politics on the national level, especially, it depends which society, which market we're talking about. If we talk about in the region, then the situation becomes almost impossible. It looks almost impossible in this moment, because you don't have much of the maneuvering room to do stuff because of the fragility of your currency, basically, mostly. So you have to. We live in a globalist world, at least in the case you're not able to produce enough for the economy, you have to import, and if you want to import, you're very dependent on the currency change. So you have to keep your currency possibly stable and possibly under big development in order to attack business. But if you want to spend too much on public expenditure, then you have wrong whether or not how the markets will respond to that. So that can be purely market response or can be political pressure also that comes with that. And when you're in a smaller economy like Serbia is, or most of the countries in this region, you have problem. Even stronger economies have that kind of issue because you don't have the basically privilege of doing with your currency what you want. Market will punish you if you try to act. I don't know. If you try to print money, or if you have more flexible fiscal and monetary policies. It is
very. Talking about money, so we're talking. Okay, one side is money, like representation of value. But if we talk about creation of value in that exchange, what are other options in this framework? What other, that is not money, but forms of exchange we can create to sustain this?
I think
but I don't know, just like what are other non-money options?
I think that the only option basically you have to build a movement. You have to build a movement that can produce these institutions that can provide for its members. So, like what Solidarity Kitchen is doing right now, for example, to provide the meals for the people in need, for example, or if you try to build communities that can provide housing for people in need, that way you can protect people from market in a way. You're not now in position to maybe do that via state, still because that would require significant financing that can influence the monetary fiscal politics. But you have to build the power to do that. And you have to economic and political power. We saw what happened with the example that always comes back with Greece when it's tried to do things differently. So you have to always expect that kind of reaction. That is both purely political, economical, but it is also it involves political pressure. From different actors that they don't want to see this succeed. I don't know if I really explained, but you cannot just hope that you can come and have simple economic solutions in terms of just monetary politics, economic politics that will implement, that won't work. The only thing that can work is building movement that can protect themselves, that can protect yourself in government, that will give you power to govern, basically, not just to elect you and then hope that you will give them better life, because at the moment that you don't do that, at the moment that the crisis comes, if the movement is not strong enough, you will be in trouble.
But I would like to add that those movements could be influential also for installing new institutions, right? For example, what Daniel also mentioned, that some where was it again, that water cannot be privatized by law. I mean, that's of course a good example. Sorry? A good example of how at least one of those basic services is forever not commodified. In that sense, creating, of course, these bases or basic services that you just need as an individual. But of course, basic income but then redistributed could also partially be part of the monetary policy.
Yeah, just when I say movement, I do mean the set of institutions, not just people as such. Yes, of course, but what they do, what the social structure that they provide, that should be institutionalized in a way that can then act as either parallel service provider, or can then change, to implement it, to put in place of existing services.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Could I ask if you don't have additional question? And I would also raise one question, or ask first Luca and then Darko and Jovica maybe to add a bit. We spoke about like building preconditions in order to have public civic cooperation, ownership of public services, And we spoke about political landscape, legal framework that we would like, or different social actors, etc. But I will now go to the beginning of your presentation. within those social actors, we also need to have citizens, and as Jovica said, to have counter narrative to tackle the narrative that the better public services are only through privatization. Mm-hmm. So, and you said like in the past 15 years there was a shift in Europe, and other countries, that to have a better services for citizens, we need to have public service and also to have public civic cooperation, ownership, implementation of those services through different types of mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So, but then my question would be, how we got to that position that citizens and different citizens initiatives are asking for the change of this narrative and are asking, struggling for getting public into the public services and also citizens. So could you maybe share a little bit about that change in Europe? And for Darko and Jovica, do you see here now in the context of Yugoslavia similar initiatives are struggling, and do we have some kind of shift now? And also, please, for others, join in these reflections as well.
Well, I think the struggle against capitalism has always been there already. What you can see, at least for Europe, I'm not sure how that entails for the whole world, is that there are more cooperatives after a time of financial constraints. So in that sense, it is partially reactionary, but it's also a constant reaction against capitalism. So in that sense, I think what we, for example, saw with the municipalist movements, they are, of course, partially reactionary against austerity measurements playing out in urban context, but are also proactively questioning how our governments are steered nowadays. So in that sense, I do think we're kind of in a new time where politics are really almost equalized with serving financialization of our life world. So in that sense, I think it's a logical reaction to that. And to repeat again, Silvia Federici, she actually said we are at point zero of neoliberalism right now. It is as in there are not that many options anymore. So in that sense, I think this is really, in a sense, an outcry where change is now needed. Yeah.
Thank you. Dan, you also some reflections on the struggles here in Croatia or Serbia?
I think that the movement in Croatia, especially but in Serbia, is also it is in its starting point, or it is still learning. It is still growing. I think it is growing. I think that when we talked 10 years ago, that there was basically no opposition to the marketological code, but now that there are many groups, many initiatives, from the very minor issues to the largest, that are trying to establish something, that are trying at least to change the narrative, if nothing else, but trying to build collaboration between themselves. So I think that this will grow, but I don't know. What are the goals that are all these initiatives are pursuing? That is the main question. Are they going to be satisfied with small things, small victories, which are extremely important to do, but can always be rolled back if you don't continue the struggle. If you manage to get that struggle started, then you need to build upon that. My feeling is that yes, the initiatives are learning, the initiatives are growing. The environment here is not good, especially in Serbia, with not enough access to the media, which you have to have in this day and age in order to not just be stuck in your own circles. But I think the issues at hand, the problems that we are facing in our daily life, are forcing a lot of groups to emerge, to try to satisfy those needs that cannot be satisfied by market at this point. So that itself is pushing. It is reactionary, like we said, but I think that resistance is always reactionary, at least at start. So those market failures are pushing people in different kind of initiative, different kind of organizing. But how will that grow? I don't know. There needs to be constant political work done. And, okay, something like this is also part of that. Thank you.
I think that's definitely one of the main challenges, right? Also how it plays out on an individual level. For example, there have been some surveys conducted about housing rights and how people actually perceive that, and that, well, at least it was conducted in the Netherlands, and the percentage of people that see housing as a right for specific groups of people or for all has been much lower than, I think, 30 or 40 years ago. So in that sense, that framework of what is actually a right is also one of the challenges that we need to work on together.
I mean, what Luca nicely said, that, I mean, here we're talking about unlocking of resources and knowledge on the municipal level, communal level. And I mean, to do that, I mean, to unlock that knowledge, you ought to have resources and knowledge. And traditionally, I mean, here in Balkans, in Yugoslavia, those who had that resources and knowledge were right-wing parties in power and church. And they were, and they still are, the most influential factors in our society. And that was, and still is, a big problem, because, I mean, initiatives usually are ad hoc, let's say, assemblies of people who are raising their voices against some specific problem, like, I don't know, somebody wants to build something on the river, something meaning electrical power, or somebody wants to do something with a park or with a building or something like that. And I mean, at least from our experience in Croatia, is that in that case it is really of uttermost importance to have some people, somebody who has been in that sector for some time and has the legal knowledge, the organizational knowledge, manpower, so who has the resources and the knowledge to give a hand to those people who are actually trying to form some kind of civil initiative. And I mean, I would say that in the last, at least, I'm talking for Croatian case because that is something that I know the best. In the last 15 years, I would say that we have had a lot of, let's say, initiatives that from ad hoc groups turned into organizations that have been working for some time and have been able to find resources, usually through European money, but then to use that European money for something good and not just to, I don't know, advocate and go to Brussels and become part of the state. And yeah, I think that is of real big importance, because without something like that, I mean, usually what you have is that you have some initiative, usually it is not successful, and after some time people just, they get exhausted and nothing happens, and you have to go all over again from the beginning. And in that case, it is really difficult to speak about something like this, about institutional change, about something that is going through time and will take us somewhere, as Daniel said in the morning, citing Andre Gorz with non-reforms, because how are you going to do something like that if you only have a couple of months and people are not connected, and these different initiatives don't have the resources to talk to each other, because, I don't know, one is in the southern part of Serbia, the other one is the north part of Serbia, and I mean, they're all volunteers, and all the money they have is actually from what they can get from people involved. So yeah, I think that is the reason. I don't know. I think that your question was also aiming about the situation in Western Europe. Maybe that was connected with all this anti-globalization movement and everything, where you got a lot of people actually who got involved. But I think that, yeah, it kind of took root in the last 15 15 years from people who were active or still active and somehow survived.
Cool. Thank you. Is anybody want to have a final question or thought to share? All right then Luca, would you like to add something?
No, thank you all for all your contributions and for your questions and for being here.